$3. That's what it cost to change the Pacific Air War. Not $3 million in research funding, not $3,000 in factory retooling, $3. A piece of piano wire barely longer than a pencil. But before I tell you how that wire saved over 80 American pilots, I need you to understand what was killing them. August 16th, 1943, 11:15 p.m. Technical Sergeant James McKenna sat alone on the floor of maintenance hangar 7 at Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea, holding a pair of needle-nose pliers in hands that wouldn't stop shaking. In front of him lay a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire that he'd salvaged from a wrecked P-38 2 weeks earlier. He'd been staring at that wire for 20 minutes, trying to decide if he was about to save a man's life or end his own career. The temperature inside the hangar was 92 degrees even at night. The humid air smelled like aviation gasoline, hot metal, and the sweet rot of the jungle pressing against the airfield perimeter. Mosquitoes buzzed against the overhead lights. In the distance, he could hear the faint rumble of Japanese night bombers, probably heading toward Port Moresby. McKenna's coveralls were soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. 6 hours earlier, Lieutenant Robert Hayes had walked into this same hangar and asked McKenna a question that violated every protocol in the Army Air Force. "Can you make my airplane turn faster? I don't care if it's against regulations. I just want a chance." McKenna had looked at Hayes and seen exactly what he'd seen in 17 other pilots over the past 6 weeks. Fear, desperation, the absolute certainty that tomorrow's mission would be his last. Hayes was 23 years old, farm kid from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the kind of face that belonged in a high school yearbook, not a combat zone. He'd been in theater for 2 months, 6 combat missions, 0 kills. His wingman had died 3 days earlier, shot down by a Zero that got inside his turning radius and stayed there through 4 desperate reversal attempts. Hayes had heard the whole thing over the radio, heard his wingman calling for help, heard him screaming that his controls weren't responding fast enough, heard the cannon fire, heard the scream cut off, then nothing but static. McKenna had worked on that wingman's aircraft the morning he died. Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21 years old, Boston. Everything on Parker's P-38 had checked out perfect. Engine timing within specifications, control surface alignment perfect, cable tensions exactly where the manual said they should be. The airplane was fine, but Parker was dead anyway, and McKenna knew why. He'd known for 2 months, ever since Lieutenant David Chen came back from a mission with 3 bullet holes in his left boom, and a story that made McKenna's blood run cold. Chen said his airplane felt like it was moving through mud when he tried to roll. Said there was a delay, just a fraction of a second, between when he moved the stick and when the aircraft responded. The Zero pilot had anticipated exactly where Chen would be. Perfect deflection shooting. That shouldn't have been possible if the P-38 had rolled immediately. Unless there was a delay. 3 weeks later, McKenna heard that Chen had been killed over Rabaul. Same story. Caught in a turning fight. Couldn't roll out fast enough. Then came Captain William Morrison. 11 kills. Squadron flight leader. One of the best pilots in the 5th Air Force. Morrison knew the P-38 inside and out. Knew its limitations. Flew smart. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison got 1 Zero on the first pass, came around for another run. 2 Zeros reversed on him. McKenna heard the radio traffic afterward from Morrison's wingman. Morrison had called out that his controls felt mushy. The Zeros stayed with him through a split S maneuver and shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison died in the crash. His crew chief was a guy McKenna knew, Rodriguez from Texas. Rodriguez had checked everything after they recovered Morrison's wreckage. Everything was within spec. The official report said pilot error. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some he knew well. Most he'd only met briefly during pre-flight checks, but he'd worked on all their aircraft, had signed off their maintenance logs, had watched them taxi out toward Japanese-controlled airspace. Some came back, some didn't. The ones who did come back all told the same story. The P-38 felt slow to respond during hard maneuvering, like there was a lag between control input and aircraft reaction. Most pilots thought that was just how the airplane handled. Heavy fighter, big control surfaces, some delay was expected. But McKenna knew that wasn't normal. He'd felt that delay with his own hands when he worked on the control cables. The P-38's aileron control cables ran through the twin booms to the tail section, then forward through pulleys to the wing control surfaces. The system had slack. Not much. Maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. But that tiny bit of slack created a delay between stick movement and aileron response. At high speeds, it didn't matter. The airflow over the control surfaces was strong enough to compensate. But at low speeds during hard-turning maneuvers, that fraction of a second delay was the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn radius and getting shot down. McKenna had mentioned this to the engineering officer 2 months ago. The officer, a captain named Whitmore from Ohio, had listened politely and then checked the technical manual. The cable tension is within factory specifications, Whitmore had said. Lockheed tolerances allow for that amount of slack. Changing it would void the aircraft warranty. Besides, no field mechanic has authorization to modify flight control systems. That would require engineering approval from Lockheed, and Lockheed is 7,000 miles away in Burbank, California. So the pilots kept dying, and McKenna kept signing off maintenance logs on aircraft he knew were going to get their pilots killed. The smell was the worst part. Every morning, McKenna worked in the maintenance area, breathing in aviation fuel, hot metal, hydraulic fluid, the smell of aircraft preparing for combat. Some of those aircraft came back, some didn't, and every morning McKenna was there again, smelling the same smells, working on more aircraft, watching more pilots walk out to machines that couldn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. The American doctrine was clear. P-38 pilots should never turn with a Zero. Never try to outmaneuver them. Use speed, use altitude, dive in, shoot, climb out. Hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. Hayes had tried that doctrine 5 times. It hadn't worked. The Zeros were too smart. They baited American pilots into turns, cut inside their turning radius, got on their tail, shot them down. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in 6 weeks. Most were shot down after being caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape. The problem wasn't that American pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it. Every training flight drilled it. The problem was that combat didn't follow doctrine. In a real dogfight, you didn't always get to choose when to turn. Sometimes the Zero forced you to turn. Sometimes you turned or you died. And when you turned in a P-38, that 3/8 of an inch of cable slack meant the Zero got inside your radius and killed you. So now McKenna sat on the hangar floor at 23:15 hours, holding $3 worth of piano wire and a pair of pliers, trying to decide if he was willing to risk a court-martial to save Hayes' life. The modification itself was simple. Bend the wire into a Z shape. Install it as an inline tensioner on the aileron control cable. Add 0.4 pounds of tension. Eliminate the slack completely. 8 minutes of work, but it violated at least a dozen regulations. Unauthorized modification of a flight control system. Use of non-standard parts. Failure to obtain engineering approval. If the modification failed during flight, Hayes would crash. McKenna would be responsible. He'd face court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison time. But if McKenna didn't do something, Hayes was going to die tomorrow. McKenna knew it. Hayes knew it. That's why Hayes had asked the question that broke every protocol. Can you make my airplane turn faster? McKenna bent the wire. The piano wire was stiff, fought back against the pliers. His hand slipped twice. On the second try, the wire cut his thumb. Blood made the wire slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. Took him 8 minutes to get the bend right. The Z-shape would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to eliminate the slack. He pulled the inspection panel off Hayes' P-38 left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. Inside, the aileron control cable ran through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. McKenna grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled. Felt the slack. 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension caught. His hands were covered in grease. His fingers ached from a full day of maintenance work. But he could feel that slack clearly. It was wrong. Installing the tensioner was harder than bending it. The space inside the boom was tight. McKenna had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. The beam kept moving. Shadows jumped across the cable system. His shoulder wedged against the boom structure. The metal edge cut into his arm. He could feel sweat running down his back. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His fingers fumbled with the clevis pin, dropped it, heard it bounce somewhere inside the boom, spent 5 minutes feeling around in the dark until he found it. The whole time, his heart was pounding. If anyone found him doing this, he was finished. He inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, reconnected the cable. The fit was tight. He had to force the clevis pin through. When it finally seated, he tested the tension by hand, pulled on the cable, no slack. The control surface moved immediately. Perfect. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, cleaned up his tools, wiped the blood off his hands, walked out of the hangar at 01:15. The tropical night was humid and still. Somewhere in the distance he heard aircraft engines. Japanese night raiders, probably. The sound made his stomach clench. He'd just modified a flight control system without authorization. If it failed, Hayes would die, and McKenna would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd killed him. But if it worked, Hayes might live. McKenna went to his bunk, didn't sleep, watched the ceiling until dawn. At 06:30, he walked to the flight line, watched the ground crew fuel and arm Hayes' aircraft, watched Hayes walk out for his pre-flight briefing, watched him climb into the cockpit. At 07:42, Hayes took off. McKenna stood on the flight line and watched the P-38 climb into the morning sky, watched it join formation with 16 other aircraft, watched them head northwest toward Japanese airspace, and then all he could do was wait. The engagement started at 08:14. Hayes' flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Zeros at 13,000 feet over Huon Gulf. The morning sun was behind them. Perfect setup for a diving attack. Hayes was flying number 3 position. His element leader called out the bounce. They rolled in. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the formation, dove from altitude, built speed to 380 miles per hour. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight. Hayes could see the painted rising sun on the fuselage. Could see the pilot's head in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 120 millimeter cannon hammered. Tracers reached out. Most missed. A few hits sparked off the 0's wing. Not enough. The 0 snap-rolled right in dove. Hayes rolled to follow. That's when he felt it. The airplane responded instantly. No delay, no lag. The stick moved and the aircraft rolled immediately. Hayes had never felt his P-38 move like that. It was like the airplane had been waiting for his command and executed it the moment he gave it. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the normal time. Got his nose down. The 0 was right there in his sight picture. He fired again. 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the 0's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The 0's engine exploded. Pieces flew off. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell toward the jungle below, trailing black smoke. Hayes' first kill. But there was no time to celebrate. His wingman called out 0's diving from above. Hayes looked up, saw 3 of them coming down in a shallow dive, coming fast. They'd seen him shoot down their friend. Now they wanted revenge. Hayes shoved the throttles forward, started to climb, but the 0's were faster in the dive. They'd be on him in seconds. His only option was to reverse and fight. Every instinct screamed at him to keep climbing, keep running. That was the doctrine. But doctrine meant dying today. He rolled hard left, pulled. The P-38 snapped around like nothing he'd ever experienced. The nose came through the horizon. He saw the lead 0. It was turning to follow him, but hadn't expected Hayes to reverse that fast. The 0 was in a bad position. Exposed. Hayes pulled lead. Fired. Hit the 0 in the left wing root. The wing folded. The 0 tumbled. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The other 2 Zeros tried to scissor with him, alternating turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed direction, his P-38 snapped into the turn instantly. No delay, no fighting the controls. The airplane did exactly what he wanted the moment he wanted it. It was like flying a different aircraft, like someone had removed invisible weights from the control system. 1 0 made a mistake, reversed too hard, bled too much speed. Hayes got inside his turn. Close range, maybe 200 feet. He fired, couldn't miss. The 0 came apart. Pieces of aircraft fell past Hayes' canopy. He felt the P-38 shudder as debris hit his right boom. 3 kills. The fourth Zero ran. Hayes didn't chase. He was low on fuel and ammunition. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with what was left of his flight, headed home. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. When Hayes landed at Dobodura at 0903, McKenna was waiting on the flight line. Hayes shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He walked straight to McKenna, said 2 words. It worked. What neither of them realized was that 6 other pilots had watched Hayes' engagement from altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell saw the entire fight from 15,000 feet. Mitchell was a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group. He'd been watching Hayes' element engage the Zeros below when he noticed something unusual. Hayes' P-38 was rolling faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen. The aircraft snapped through maneuvers like it weighed half what it should. Mitchell knew every pilot in theater, knew their skill levels. Hayes was good, but not that good. Something was different about his airplane. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still amped up on adrenaline, hands shaking as he filled out the combat report. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked him what was different. Hayes said he didn't know. His airplane just responded better today. Faster. Mitchell asked if maintenance had done anything to the aircraft. Hayes said he should talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna. Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area 2 hours later. McKenna was working on a different P-38. His hands were black with grease. His coveralls were stained with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell asked him directly, "What did you do to Hayes' airplane?" McKenna looked at him for a long moment, then told him, "The piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, the unauthorized change to the flight control system." Mitchell listened without interrupting. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked if he could do the same modification to Mitchell's aircraft. McKenna said yes, but Mitchell had to understand the risks. The modification wasn't approved, wasn't tested. If something went wrong, both of them would face charges. Mitchell said he didn't care. He'd lost 4 pilots in his flight in the past month, all caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there was something that could help them survive, he wanted it. Regulations could wait. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38. Same piano wire tensioner, same installation method, 8 minutes. Mitchell flew it the next morning, came back raving about the improvement. The airplane rolled like a fighter instead of a truck, he told his wingman. The wingman told McKenna he wanted the modification too. Before we go further, if you're finding this story as incredible as I did when I first discovered it, hit that like button right now. It helps more people discover these forgotten stories from World War II. And make sure you're subscribed because next week I'm covering an equally insane story about a Sherman tank crew that did something even the Germans thought was impossible. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. Word spread through the squadron. Pilots started asking their crew chiefs if they'd heard about the cable modification. Some crew chiefs refused, said it was against regulations. Others were willing to try. McKenna showed them how. Cut the piano wire, bend it into a Z shape, install it as an inline tensioner, takes 8 minutes, changes everything. The modification spread pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations in the ready room and maintenance area. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd, using the modified controls. Mitchell got 3 on August 25th. Other pilots started coming back from missions with kills. The statistics were impossible to ignore. Lieutenant James Watkins was a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group, stationed at Goosop. He heard about the modification from a pilot who transferred from Dobodura. Watkins was skeptical, but he tried it on 1 aircraft. The pilot came back from the next mission with his first kill after 8 weeks of combat. Watkins modified 4 more aircraft. Other crew chiefs in the 49th started doing it too. By early September, maybe 40 P-38s in New Guinea had the modification. The engineering officer at Dobodura, Captain Whitmore, noticed something was different but couldn't figure out what. Control cable tensions checked out during inspections because the crew chiefs removed the tensioners before inspections and reinstalled them afterward. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. Nobody told the officers. The kill ratio started shifting. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific lost 2 P-38s for every Zero destroyed. In August, it was 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. Something had changed, but officially, nobody knew what. Then the Japanese noticed. Japanese fighter pilots first reported the change in the late August. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet mentioned that American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly. The reports noted that tactics which had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top aces, 64 confirmed kills. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. On September 3, 1943, Sakai engaged a P-38 over Wewak. He used his standard tactic, drew the American into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, then snapped his turn back the opposite direction to get inside the American's turning radius. Except the P-38 reversed with him. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll, knew the timing perfectly, but this P-38 rolled faster than it should have. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision. The American got guns on him. Sakai had to dive away. He returned to base confused and frustrated. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were still using the same tactics, but their aircraft were responding faster, fractionally, but enough to matter, enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s, found no obvious modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been fighting for months. Same engines, same armament. Nothing visible had changed. What the Japanese didn't know was that the change was hidden inside the boom, a 6-inch piece of piano wire that looked like original equipment. Even if they'd found it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon system, wasn't a new engine, just a minor modification to control cable tension. But that minor modification was killing their pilots. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38s at rates they hadn't seen since early in the war. The psychological impact was significant. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the sky in turning fights. They knew they could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. That confidence was breaking down. Pilots who used to press attacks were becoming cautious, hesitant. They weren't sure anymore if their tactics would work. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots stopped trying to get into turning fights with P-38s, used hit-and-run tactics instead. But that meant giving up their main advantage. The Zero's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms. And the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, could take more damage. Other pilots tried to compensate by being more aggressive, closing to shorter range before firing, taking more risks. But aggression without the ability to outturn the enemy just meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September, trying tactics that had worked perfectly in July. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what, and they couldn't figure out how to counter it. You can't develop tactics against a modification you don't know exists. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. American losses in the same period were 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, P-38s were killing Zeros at better than 1-to-1. Japanese command ordered pilots to avoid engaging P-38s unless they had significant numerical advantage. That order marked a turning point. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted. And it all came down to a piece of piano wire that nobody was supposed to install. The modification never became official during the war. The Army Air Force Engineering Command learned about it in October 1943 when a maintenance inspector at Dobadura noticed inconsistent cable tension readings. He traced the discrepancies to the piano wire tensioners, wrote a report, sent it up the chain of command. The report sat on desks for 3 weeks while officers debated what to do. The modification violated regulations, but it was working. Fighter squadrons using the modification had measurably better kill ratios. Pilots were surviving. The question wasn't whether the modification helped. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who'd installed it without authorization or quietly approve it after the fact. In November, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the modification. They tested it, measured the cable tension, calculated the stress loads, ran flight tests. Their conclusion was that the modification was safe and effective. It should have been part of the original design. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model that entered production in December 1943. But McKenna never received official credit. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any report. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the control system improvement to engineering analysis. McKenna's name didn't appear anywhere. Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions, shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children, worked as a crop duster for 37 years. He never forgot what McKenna had done. Every year on August 17th, Hayes called McKenna to thank him for saving his life. Mitchell also survived. He became a squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, shot down 16 aircraft. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, retired as a colonel in 1963. He told the story of McKenna's modification to every young maintenance officer he supervised, made sure they understood that sometimes the best solutions come from enlisted mechanics who see problems the engineers miss. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to California, went back to working on cars, opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948, worked on engines for 42 years. Never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes. That's all. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications found references to the piano wire tensioner in maintenance logs from New Guinea. The historian tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. McKenna was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked him about the modification. McKenna confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the modification may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used it. McKenna said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back: Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, the others. That was enough. James McKenna died in 2006 at age 88. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner, did not mention that he'd changed how American fighters flew, did not mention that he'd broken regulations to save lives. His garage in Long Beach is still there, different owner now, but on the wall in the back office, there's a faded photograph. A young mechanic in coveralls standing next to a P-38 Lightning. The date written on the back is August 1943, New Guinea. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through official channels or engineering committees, through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. $3, 8 minutes, 80 lives. If this story moved you the way it moved me, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. This community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history students, and every comment helps YouTube show this video to more people who need to hear these forgotten stories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.